Hey everyone, and welcome to a deep dive that I think will really get you thinking. We're going to be exploring the power of thought today.
Ooh, that's a good one.
Yeah, it is. We'll be looking at whether our thoughts can actually create our reality.
Okay.
Our source material for this deep dive is a talk that was originally given in Spanish.
Interesting.
Yeah, it is. It's full of really interesting analogies and personal stories from the speaker's own life. And our big question here is it really true that our thoughts create our reality?
I'm ready to dive in.
So one of the first things that really jumped out at me from this talk was this analogy about a sponge.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
It's such a good way to think about how we just soak up ideas and beliefs when we're kids without even realizing it. Like, did you have any of those kind of rules about life growing up that you just accepted as truth?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, so many things that were just how things were.
Right. And the speaker in the talk even mentions pushing back on this idea at first. They were like, wait, what beliefs? I just live this way. It's funny, but it's so true.
It really is. And it makes sense when you think about it from a psychological perspective. These early beliefs become our foundation. They form our core belief system.
Right.
And that can have a huge impact on how we see the world, even as adults. Like, think about cognitive biases. We all have them.
What are those again?
Cognitive biases are basically these mental shortcuts our brains develop to process information quickly, but they can lead us to favor information that confirms our existing beliefs, even if it's not entirely accurate.
So basically, they're like these filters that we've developed based on what we learned as kids.
Exactly. And those filters can really impact how we interpret everything that happens to us.
Wow. That's pretty profound.
It is, and it brings us to another really interesting point that the speaker makes, the idea of ceding our free will.
Ooh, yeah, that one kind of threw me for a loop at first.
It's a bit of a head-scratcher, isn't it?
It is. Basically, the speaker is saying that by blindly following these ingrained thought patterns and societal expectations, we're essentially giving away our ability to make conscious choices. Is that right?
That's the gist of it. It's like we're living our lives on autopilot, reacting to situations based on this pre-programmed set of beliefs, instead of pausing and making choices from a place of true awareness.
That makes me think about the classic Sunday night anxiety. You know, that feeling of dread that some people get before the work week starts.
Oh yeah, definitely. The Sunday scaries.
Yeah. Is that really a conscious choice? Or is it more like a conditioned response based on how we think we should feel about work?
That's a great example. It really highlights how much of our experience is shaped by these underlying beliefs, whether we're aware of them or not.
And you know what else the speaker mentions? This hilarious anecdote about cutting the tail off the fish.
Oh yes, I love that one.
It's so good. Generations of people have been doing this, cutting the tail off the fish before cooking it, just because at some point way back when, someone had a pot that was too small to fit the whole fish.
It's such a perfect illustration of how we blindly follow traditions and habits without ever questioning the why behind them.
Right, like how many things do we do in our lives just because that's how it's always been done?
Right, and that's where the power of observation comes in. The speaker really emphasizes the need to become aware of our thoughts, to pay attention to that constant mental chatter that's going on inside our heads.
Yeah, and they have this amazing visual to describe that mental chatter. It's like a fat guy on a slide.
That's the one. It's so vivid, isn't it?
It totally is. Like constantly careening from one thought to the next,
Yeah.
never really stopping to take a breath.
And it's not just any thoughts. Right. The speaker is really concerned with those negative thought patterns, the fear, the anxiety, the worries about the future. That stuff can really weigh us down.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, they describe it as this feeling of always being on edge, afraid of falling, never quite feeling safe or secure.
And it's easy to get caught up in that cycle, especially if we're not aware of what's happening in our minds.
That's where mindfulness comes in, right? Like meditation and things like that.
Absolutely. The more we can cultivate that present moment awareness, the less we get swept away by those anxieties and fears.
Makes sense. So it's not just about becoming aware of our thoughts. It's also about what we do with those thoughts once we notice them.
Exactly. And that's where things can get a little tricky, because the speaker takes this idea even further. They suggest that there's a direct link between our internal chaos, all that negativity and fear we carry within, and the experiences we attract in the external world.
Whoa, so our inner world is actually reflected back to us in our outer reality.
That's the idea. It can be a tough one to wrap your head around.
It is. But it makes me think about those times when it seems like everything goes wrong when you're in a bad mood.
Right, like you spill your coffee, miss the bus, And everyone seems to be in a grumpy mood, too.
Exactly. Is that just a coincidence or is it something more?
Well, the speaker would say that it's not a coincidence, that our internal state is actually shaping our perception of events. Like we're wearing these negativity goggles that filter out all the good stuff and amplify the bad.
I can see that. And the speaker even shared a personal story about how this played out for them during the pandemic. They were feeling so overwhelmed by fear and negativity. And it seemed like those feelings were manifesting as a series of really challenging external situations.
That's a powerful example.
It is. But here's the thing. They were eventually able to shift their thinking with the support of their loved ones, and things started to improve.
So even in the midst of really difficult circumstances, we have the power to choose a different perspective.
Exactly. And that brings us to what I think is the most empowering part of the whole talk. We have the power to choose different thoughts.
Right. Even if it feels hard at first.
Yes. And the speaker even said it straight out. You can decide to be happy if you want to. Do you think it's really that simple?
Well, it's not always easy, but I do think there's a lot of truth to that statement. It's about recognizing that we have a choice in every moment. We can choose to focus on the negative, or we can choose to look for the positive.
Okay, so how do we actually do that? How do we make that shift?
There are a lot of different tools and techniques that can help. One is called cognitive reframing. It's about consciously challenging negative thought patterns and choosing to see things in a more positive or realistic light.
So it's like we're rewiring our brains to create new pathways for more helpful thoughts.
Exactly. And affirmations can be really powerful too. Repeating positive statements to yourself can actually help to reprogram your subconscious mind.
I like that. So we're not just at the mercy of our thoughts. We can actually train our minds to think differently.
We can. And one of the coolest things about this talk is how the speaker uses this metaphor from the movie Trolls to illustrate this idea.
Yeah. The trolls and the Bergens. I love that part.
Me too. It's such a great way to understand the difference between seeking happiness externally and finding it within.
Right. Like the trolls are just naturally happy and radiant, no matter what's going on around them.
Exactly. They represent that inherent joy that's already inside of us.
And then you have the Bergens, these grumpy creatures who believe that they can only find happiness by consuming it from some external source.
Like they need to devour something outside of themselves to feel whole.
It's such a perfect analogy for how so many of us live our lives. We're always chasing after that next thing, thinking that it will finally make us happy.
But true happiness and fulfillment come from within, and that ties in beautifully with the speaker's ultimate message, which is about returning to a state of unity with the divine, shedding those limiting beliefs, and recognizing our inherent divinity.
Yeah, that's such a powerful concept, that we're all fundamentally connected to something greater than ourselves.
And when we tap into that connection, we can access a level of joy and fulfillment that transcends external circumstances.
That's amazing. So what really stood out to you from all of this? I feel like there's so many layers to unpack.
You know what I find most inspiring is how the speaker seamlessly blends insights from psychology, spirituality, and personal experience. It's not just theory. They're speaking from the heart, sharing their own journey.
I agree. And they use such evocative language and imagery, like the fat guy on the slide, the trolls and the Bergens. It really brings these ideas to life.
Absolutely. And I think that's part of what makes this talk so powerful. It speaks to both our heads and our hearts.
For sure. So if we step back and look at the bigger picture, what's the main takeaway for our listener today?
I think the core message is this. We are not victims of our circumstances. We have more power than we realize to create a more positive and fulfilling reality, starting with our own thoughts.
And it all begins with observation. Right. Paying attention to our thoughts. Noticing where we're giving our power away. And making a conscious choice to think differently.
Exactly. It's a journey. And it's not always easy, but it's a journey worth taking.
It's funny, right? Like before we really sat down with this talk, I thought this whole thoughts create reality thing was kind of out there.
Oh, I know what you mean.
Like it just felt a little too woo-woo for me personally. But the way this speaker breaks it down, with all the real-life examples and the psychology behind it, it actually makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think that's the key. It's easy to dismiss those ideas when they're presented in a vague way or like a one-size-fits-all solution. But when you actually see how it connects to things like our subconscious or those cognitive biases, it becomes much more believable.
Totally. And one thing that really stuck with me is that the speaker isn't talking about just slapping on a happy face and pretending everything is fine. It's more about recognizing we have a choice in how we react to difficult situations.
Exactly.
And you're building a more positive way of looking at things, even when things are tough.
Right. It's not about ignoring the reality of what's happening. It's more like taking responsibility for how we respond to it.
Yes. And using what happens to us to grow and learn. I really liked how the speaker talked about the divine, too. Like how we're all connected to something bigger than ourselves.
Me too. It's like that idea that real happiness doesn't come from stuff or accomplishments. It comes from inside, you know.
Yes.
It reminds me of that analogy with the trolls and the Bergens.
Oh, yeah. They're a perfect example.
Right. The trolls are like pure joy, just naturally, no matter what's happening around them.
They are. And the Bergens are always looking for happiness outside of themselves,
Always searching for that next thing to gobble up, thinking that that's what will make them happy.
which is kind of how our world works these days, right?
It really is. There's always that pressure to buy more, do more, be more.
So how do we get away from that? What does the speaker say?
Well, it starts with realizing we have a choice.
Okay.
We can choose to focus on the lack, or we can choose to cultivate a sense of inner peace and joy.
I like that. But how do we actually do that?
It's a practice, for sure.
Yeah.
But the speaker gives us a few ideas. Remember, they talked about becoming aware of our thoughts and then consciously choosing to think differently.
Oh, right. Like using things like affirmations or reframing our thoughts.
Exactly. Those are great tools to help us shift those ingrained thought patterns.
It's like we can actually train our minds to be more positive.
We can. And the more we do that, the more our external reality starts to reflect that inner shift.
I like that. It's like that quote, change your thoughts, change your world.
Exactly. It's not just a nice idea. It's really how it works.
It's powerful stuff, for sure. And what I really appreciate about this talk is that it's not just about changing our thoughts for the sake of changing our thoughts.
Yeah.
It's about aligning with who we really are at our core,
Yeah.
tapping into that inherent joy and goodness that the speaker talks about.
Absolutely. It's like becoming more like those trolls, embracing that natural state of happiness and letting it flow out into everything we do.
I love that.
Yeah.
So as we're wrapping up this part of our deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a question to think about.
Okay.
What if we really do have the power to create our own reality? What kind of world would you choose to create?
That's a great question. And I hope it's one that our listeners really take some time to ponder.
It's funny. As we've been talking about all this, I've been thinking about my own life. Like some of the patterns I fall into, I can totally see how things I picked up as a kid. Those beliefs and ideas have shaped how I think about myself in relationships and even work.
It happens to all of us. We don't even realize how much we're running on those old scripts. Like we're living someone else's story without knowing it.
Yeah. But that's what I find so hopeful about what this speaker's saying.
Yeah.
It's not about being stuck, It's about realizing we have the power to make different choices. Like we can actually change the story.
Absolutely. And there are tools to help with that. Like you were talking about before, cognitive reframing affirmations, all of that stuff can really help to shift those old thought patterns.
Totally. It's like we can train our minds to focus on what's good, to see what's possible instead of getting stuck in limitations.
Exactly. And when we change our inner world, our outer world starts to change too.
It's like that saying, change your thoughts, change your world. It's not just a nice saying. It's actually true.
It is. And what I really appreciate about this talk is that it connects the practical stuff with something deeper. It's not just about thinking happy thoughts all the time.
Yeah.
It's more about tapping into that inner joy and goodness that's already there, like the speaker talks about.
That connection to something bigger.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's so important.
Mm-hmm.
It's not about chasing happiness. It's about finding that peace inside that just radiates outward.
Like the trolls.
Yes,
They
exactly.
don't have to try to be happy. It just flows out of them naturally.
I love that.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, is there one thing you want our listeners to take away from all of this?
I think the most important thing is to remember, you are not your thoughts. You have the power to choose what you think. And when you choose to think differently, you can actually change your reality.
That is powerful. So for our listeners out there, I hope this conversation has been interesting, maybe even inspiring.
Thank you.
Remember, even a small change in your thinking can make a big difference. So keep exploring these ideas, keep asking questions, and most importantly, keep believing in your power to create the life you want.
That's it. Thanks for having me.
It was my pleasure. And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.